And it's a great honour for me to be here, and I feel a little humbled, and I feel maybe it's rather presumptuous. In February last year, Amina, a woman in her late 50s, told me the story of how her family left Palestine in 1948. Her mother was cooking at the stove, she said, when enemy soldiers entered the house. They took the children out. Her mother left the food on the stove. A soldier told her to turn it off and to bring mattresses to sleep outside. She asked where they would go. He replied they would return. They came to Beirut, she said. They were in a mosque which was divided by mattresses as walls. After that, they went to Shatila and lived in tents. There were storms, so people moved closer together to protect themselves. They started to build tin walls. Amina's father was later murdered in the 1982 Sabra and Shatila massacre. She now lives in the Ain al-Hilwa refugee camp in southern Lebanon. Her story encapsulates the lack of choice or safety for families forced from their homes and turned into refugees, and also the necessity of survival, not only of individuals, but also of the Palestinians as a national entity. In this paper, in light of the perceived crisis of identity, I will look at how Palestinian women, both in Palestine itself and in the diaspora, contribute to the project of identity construction and preservation. In the face of escalating hopelessness in terms of living conditions and future prospects for peace and security, Palestinian women adopt various modes of survival to protect themselves and their children. They confront efforts to negate their identity through memory, solidarity, and dissent. In 2006 and 2007, I conducted research with Palestinian refugee women in Lebanon, and also with women, refugees and non-refugees in the West Bank. And in my paper, I will discuss how ways of articulating identity have changed over time, and the effects women have had on the expressions of national identity. I will focus firstly on articulations of identity by women, next on what Mahmoud Darwish calls the blessings of memory, the remarkable stories told by women about their life histories. Thirdly, on shared experiences of suffering in exile and under occupation, and in particular on the role of morality and modes of resistance. And finally, on the many ways in which women challenge adversity in order to create a more tolerable future for themselves and their families. Palestinian national identity has been shattered and demoralized, and is now associated with shame, victimization, failure. One could argue, however, that it was never an identity wholeheartedly shared by all members of the community. Traditionally, men have led the way in constructing ideologies and going into battle. Women have tended to support male initiatives with varying degrees of enthusiasm. By contrasting what Ted Swedenborg describes as official Palestinian nationalism with women's subtle subversion of nationalist discourse, I will argue that the shape of Palestinian identity is changing to accommodate more fluid elements of belonging. I will start by trying to define identity, and then by examining various aspects of Palestinian identity and how women enact notions of identity construction and preservation. There is abundant literature on the question of identity, and much of it is relevant to the Palestinian case. Identity can be considered either in terms of the individual or of the group. However, as Bowman remarks, although Palestinians' memories of a common origin give them a ground and a symbolic repertoire for identity, it is their experiences which provide references for these symbols and a landscape for that ground. The sense of a distinct national identity for Palestinians started to take shape in the early 20th century in response to the encroachment of political Zionism in Palestine and the influence of nationalist ideologies elsewhere. Sari Hanafi argues that although the construction of Palestinian identity began after the establishment of the British Mandate in Palestine, the crystallization of this identity is a relatively new phenomenon. It was from the start an identity rooted in traumatic experience. constantly caught between the competing narratives of Jewish entitlement and Arab self-determination, Palestinian national identity developed characteristics of struggle, resistance, and defeat. It was a response to hurt and disappointment. After 1948 and the creation of the Israeli state, Palestinian national identity came to be seen as somehow shameful or problematic. In response, Palestinians began to create a narrative of heroism. It contained, in Hobsbawm's words, an element of artifact and invention which enters into the making of nations. They were determined to demonstrate that the Palestinian people as a unique national entity was not going to disappear. Edward Said has written that exiles are cut off from their roots, their land, their past. They feel, therefore, an urgent need to reconstruct their broken lives, usually by choosing to see themselves as part of a triumphant ideology or a restored people. After the defeat of 1982, however, a counter-narrative began to be articulated. Although it acknowledged Palestinian victimization, it also incorporated qualities of survival and ways of fighting back which did not necessarily resort to armed force. It is here, I think, that we can begin to appreciate the more subtle contributions made by women. Various authors have noted the absence of women's voices in the construction of the national narrative. Swedenborg, for example, speaks of men as the primary authorities on local history and public affairs in general. Palestinian women's memories have rarely found a place, and therefore their voices tend to be excluded, their concerns often minimized or disregarded altogether. One concludes, therefore, that communal identity is a male construct with little reference to the particular experiences of women. While Palestinian women certainly played a full part in the liberation movement of the 1970s and 1980s, their involvement in other areas of identity formation is equally significant. Let me give a few examples. Firstly, in the 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon, women performed countless vital functions. For example, the Israelis bombarded the Ain al-Hilwa refugee camp in Sidon, so the camp was evacuated, and some of the refugees took shelter in a hospital. But the hospital was attacked too. Women in these places, says Suad, a woman in her late 50s, were cooking, washing clothes. It provided a basic level of survival. They brought flour to make bread. It was distributed to all the people. There were no male adults to take care of the family, so the women had to do it. It was a big responsibility for women. Life was hard at that time. 3 or 4 families had to live together. The role of Palestinian women during this period, explained Naila, a resident of the Ain al-Hilwa camp, was to take care of their families after the imprisonment of the men. Women also worked to rebuild the destroyed camp, sometimes with their bare hands. In Naila's words, journalists came. They saw how the women were cleaning the camp and trying to make it feel like home. When they saw women cleaning and using cement to rebuild the houses, they asked why we were doing it. The women replied, we were working like this because the young men were in prison. Slowly we were able to rebuild the houses so that the families could return. These narratives illustrate the extraordinary resilience displayed by many women during this very frightening period. My second example recalls the First Intifada, during which women in the West Bank and Gaza participated in innovative ways in resisting the Israeli occupation. For example, women took part in protests and confrontations with the Israeli army. They were central in organising and maintaining essential services, such as education for children and students, the provision of healthcare, and the distribution of basic foodstuffs. Their work was social, but also political, and their behaviour, as in Lebanon, challenged traditional forms of social control, such as the family and the patriarchal nature of society. Raja Shahadi has spoken of the strength of these women. They have the least to lose, he writes, and no ego to be pampered. They have been used to brutal oppression by men from the day they were born. To give another example, in the run-up to the Palestinian elections of January 2006, women took an active part in the victory of Hamas. Having endured 7 years of disproportionate Israeli aggression, and the construction of an architectural oppression in the West Bank, many Palestinians, including women, who expressed frustration at their inability to play a more meaningful role in the Second Intifada, have come to regard violent resistance that has the support of religion as being one of the few options available to them. This is one of the reasons why Palestinians, especially women, voted Hamas into power in the January 2006 election. In the words of Maha, a student at Dissent University, people voted for Hamas because they needed to see changes in all aspects of life. Islamic movements, she added, look at a woman in a different way to others. They look beyond her body to her mind, and this is attractive to women. During the election campaign, Hamas effectively mobilized women. For example, women went to different houses and convinced other women to vote for Hamas. Finally, my final example, if we look at the refugee camps of Lebanon today, we can see the diverse supportive and constructive activities undertaken by women. Many women in the camps speak of being weary of politics. Political and military struggles, they argue, have failed to retrieve the homeland or solve the conflict. In the meantime, there are many practical pressures on them to ensure the well-being of their children, to protect their own rights in an environment which remains patriarchal, to care for the elderly and vulnerable members of their community, and above all, to tell the story of Palestine to the world. Palestinian women, both those who live in Palestine and those now located outside the borders of their homeland, possess a rich store of memories. It was women, both in Lebanon and the West Bank, who told me about Palestine as homeland. Their memories are characterized by respect for a way of life and place. Those old enough to remember Palestine before 1948 described life in traditional village settings. What came across to me most strongly were feelings of continuity, familiarity, and satisfaction. For example, Nabil, an 80-year-old woman from the village of Kabri in northern Palestine, described how she used to work in the fields and orchards. Her family grew grapes and olives and pressed the olives to make oil. Everything came from the land, she said. Layla, a woman in her late 60s who was born in Palestine, spoke of trust between neighbours. They were simple people, she said, and they had good hearts. And Hala, who left Palestine when she was 15, recalled that her village was very lovely. It had big orchards. Her father was a carpenter. They lived a very happy life and helped each other. This raises the question of how memories such as these affect identity today. As Rosemary Saeed notes, the village with its special arrangement of houses and orchards, its open meeting places, its burial ground, its collective identity, was built into the personality of each individual villager to a degree that makes separation like an obliteration of the self. The familiar life was interrupted, and violently interrupted and effectively ended in 1948. At that time, Palestine was a predominantly rural society, and identity, therefore, was strongly associated with the land. Swedenborg argues that an individual's loss of land to Zionist colonization came to be regarded as an affront to the national honor. These constituents of the male individual's identity, family, honor, land, women, resonated with the aura of the nation. But what implications does this have for women's notions of identity? Refugee women tell stories of change, of how they and their families were abruptly uprooted from their places of belonging and plunged into terrifying uncertainty. Mariam, a woman who was born in Palestine in 1936 and now lives in Beirut, told me about her childhood in Jaffa. She described hearing bombs and shooting at night, people shouting. In April 1948, she recalls, they headed north to a landscape of explosions and overturned vehicles. The family left most of their possessions behind, confident that the problem would soon be solved. She never saw her home again. Layla, who left Palestine when she was a child, recalled her mother telling her that because of the bombs, people would have to leave for a week or two. So they left without clothing or even documents. Her older sister was engaged and had a pair of new shoes for her wedding, but her family said, don't wear your new shoes or they will be ruined. So she left them, remembered Layla, for the Israelis. The family now lives in Burj al-Barashni camp in Beirut. I mean, there's a lot more, but I'll move. I wanted to talk a bit about morality, but I'll move very quickly. I don't have any more time. I'm going to move to the conclusion. It's quite short. I want to consider in conclusion some of the ways in which women work to challenge adversity and how these differ from male methods of dealing with crisis and threat. Modes of survival articulated by women fall into three main categories. Firstly, she is an activist working side by side with men in the liberation struggle and national resistance. Secondly, she is a mother struggling to protect her children from harm, responsible for the production of the next generation who will continue the struggle. And thirdly, she is a keeper of memory and protector of national identity. However, many observers argue that Palestinian national identity is currently facing a crisis, assaulted by fragmentation from within and demonization from outside. Notions of national identity clearly have undergone significant changes since 1948. In the process, Palestinians have developed new ways of envisaging themselves as a nation. Since the majority of Palestinians are now situated outside the borders of their original homeland, their evolving identity contains some notion of cosmopolitanism. They live in diasporic communities. It is possible, therefore, to discern two distinct facets of identity, one in Palestine itself and the other among Palestinians outside the country. But both are assailed by a degree of crisis, and both involve the input of women. I think that women have strongly influenced the evolution of a transnational diasporic identity rooted both in the memory of place and the reality of placelessness. Edward Said has referred to the difficulty for Palestinians of being heard. In his words, whenever a Palestinian tries to tell a story, to put in a dramatic and realizable way the interrupted story of Palestine and its connection to the story of Israel, it's systematically attacked. In his opening remarks at the Madrid Peace Conference of October 1991, Haider Abdul-Shafi said, "It is time for us to narrate our own story." I think that women have found it more difficult than men to make their voices heard, to narrate their own stories, and their attempts to gain respect as participants in the process of identity construction have been similarly problematic. At the same time, as Shahadi said, women's lack of ego and the fact they have less to lose has meant they have had no choice but to develop other forms of strength. By surviving the cruelties of exile and occupation and locating appropriate methods of coping with crises, Palestinian women have been able to subvert notions of a Palestinian national identity, and therefore, I believe, are well placed to deal with the current crisis in Palestinian society. Thank you.